Well, good morning. Beautiful day. Can't imagine a better setting to be discussing Adaline Kent than the one we're in, right? Yeah, we had a dinner last night, a premiere dinner to thank our sponsors, and it was a lot of fun, but now we get to dig into the content, so I'm really excited. I'm David Walker. I'm the CEO of the Nevada Museum of Art. I've been here since 2007, happily. And we want to thank you for being at the symposium today. This is something we started a couple of years ago following the opening of exhibitions to really get in and unpack a lot of the content in the exhibitions here at the museum. This symposium, of course, is in connection with Adaline Kent, The Click of Authenticity, and we will have a buffet luncheon, a casual luncheon at the conclusion, so we can continue getting to know each other better. So looking forward to that. Organized by Apsara DiQuinzio, our trailblazing senior curator of contemporary art here at the Nevada Museum of Art. This exhibition and the publication, which is beautiful, by the way, is a long overdue examination of this mid-century artist, Adaline Kent. As some of you know, Kent hailed from the town Kentfield in Marin County, California. This town was named after her grandfather, Albert Kent. And her legendary family of early environmentalists donated land to the U.S. government to preserve the areas now known as Muir Woods National Monument and the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Much of her artistic practice was inspired by her annual explorations in the summer of the Sierra Nevada nearby. And like I said, this is just a wonderful day for us to have this conversation with this beautiful setting in our sky room here. I would like to recognize the Kent family members who are here with us today. So if you wouldn't mind standing. Yay. We're so happy you're here, and I know, I feel like I've known you for a long time because Apsara, I think, is sort of a family member now, right? It feels that way, but what a collaboration it's been with Apsara to put this whole project together. We're super excited about that. I also want to thank quickly today's presenters. They're going to get their due later, but I wanted to say that we're going to start off, of course, with Apsara DiQuinzio, who, again, is our Senior Curator of Contemporary Art, Jeff Gunderson, Archivist and Librarian for the San Francisco Art Institute, Alexander Nemerov, who is the Carl and Marilynn Thoma Provostial. Is that how you say that? Is that close enough? Provostial, professor in the arts and humanities at Stanford University. I've seen that word before, but I've never had to say it. And we have Jenny Sorkin, who's with us from Santa Barbara. She is a professor of history of art and architecture at UC Santa Barbara. And Elaine Yao, who is with us from UC Berkeley, where she is an associate curator. And finally, this symposium and the exhibition downstairs in the second floor would not be possible without the generous sponsorship. And I'm going to read our sponsors to you. They're up here, but I want to read them anyway. Our major sponsors, Jenny and Garrett Zook Sutton and his company Corporate Direct. Our sponsors are Charles and Margaret Burback Foundation, Barbara and Tad Dance, Maureen Malarkey and Steve Miller, Linda and Alvaro Piscato, the Six Talents Foundation, Roswitha Kima Smale, Kea and Kevin Stanley, and we get down to supporting sponsors, Carol Anderson, Kathy Bartlett, Betsy Burgess and Tim Bailey, Chica Charitable Trust, Evercore Wealth Management, and Gayla Howard Hilgard, and additional support by Pamela Joyner and Fred Jafrida. So, without further ado, please welcome Apsara DiQuinzio.
Okay, welcome. Maybe I should move this down a little. Thank you all for coming. I'm Apsara DiQuinzio, and today we're here to honor and reflect on the life and work of Adaline Kent. It's hard to believe, but this is actually the first retrospective of Kent's work in 65 years. Her last exhibition took place in 1958 at SF MoMA in what was then known as the San Francisco Museum of Art. And that exhibition also traveled to the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York. And Betty Parsons represented Adaline Kent. There are over 120 works of art in the exhibition, which span the artist's entire career and demonstrate the incredible range of her practice. Many of these works have not been seen publicly in 65 years or ever. The exhibition charts several overarching themes in her practice, ranging from her early figurative work, her later abstract sculptures, paintings, and works on paper, her interest in infinity and the High Sierra, and the importance of movement and balance in her work. It brings me great pleasure to present this exhibition here at the Nevada Museum of Art, where the surrounding landscape resonates so beautifully with Kent's work. And I would like to thank David Walker and Ann Wolf and the entire museum staff for their support in realizing this exhibition. And I especially want to thank and acknowledge the fabulous Claire Munoz and the education team for all of their efforts today in organizing this symposium. Many of Kent's family members are already here, as you know, they just stood. And so I want to thank them for their steadfast collaborative spirit throughout the process of researching and implementing this project. And it's been a great honor and privilege to work with them to bring this work, the work of this remarkable artist, to light. Today's program will include the speakers that David just mentioned, beginning with my own, and each presentation is about 20 minutes. We will have a short 10-minute break after the third presentation, and after all of the presentations, we will all reconvene up here for a moderated discussion, and then we'll have lunch together. So, let's see, is this the first slide? Yeah, okay. So Kent was referred to as an infinity-conscious artist by those who knew her well. In her work, the infinity symbol aligns with representations of alpine lakes, waterfalls, and ski slopes. It can be understood as a fusion of her interests in time, space, and nature. In this presentation, I will highlight how the infinity symbol manifests in her work and how this was connected to her experience of time and space in the mountains. Born in 1900, she grew up in the shadow of Mount Tamalpais. Her family home was nestled at the mountain's base in the woodsy town of Kentfield in Marin County, California. She was one of 7 children, born to Congressman William Kent and the prominent suffragette Elizabeth Thatcher Kent. Kentfield was named after William's father, as David mentioned, Albert Emmett Kent, who bought the designated land from James Ross in 1871. Today, the area is now known as Ross Kentfield. Adaline grew up with a rich appreciation of the natural world. The Kents were leading environmentalists of their time. They saved Redwood Canyon from being decimated by the logging industry by donating 435 acres of the forest to the federal government to ensure that it would be forever preserved. On January 9th, 1908, as a result of their efforts, President Theodore Roosevelt established Muir Woods National Monument, naming it, at William Kent's insistence, after his friend, the naturalist and philosopher John Muir. They also donated land that became Tamalpais State Park and Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and they even donated land along Lake Tahoe to create a public beach now known as the William Kent State Beach. After graduating Vassar College in 1923, Kent attended the California School of Fine Arts, now known as the San Francisco Art Institute, for a year, and studying with the Great Bay Area social realist Ralph Stackpole, who taught her direct carving techniques. In 1924, she went to Paris, where she would live for several years while making trips back and forth to the Bay Area. And for a brief time, she studied at the Grand Chaumier Academy with Antoine Burdel, who was a former student of Auguste Rodin and also taught artists such as Henri Matisse and Alberto Giacometti. Bordel was known for his dynamic sculptures that rely on opposing planes to establish a sense of rhythmic tension and balance and keep the eye moving around forms carved in stone or cast in bronze. Kent moved back to San Francisco in 1929 and took up a studio at what was referred to as the Monkey Block building. I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Jeff Gunderson. It was a hub for artists, including Robert B. Howard and Ralph Stackpole. And here you see her in her studio with her sculpture Nightclub, which she made for the San Francisco Stock Exchange Club. And this was an early photo shoot, one of the first photo shoots of her in her studio. And here's a close-up of her, which is just amazing. And from the same photo shoot, in her goggles and hammer and chisel, but note the scarf that she is wearing with its infinity rings. And this is the earliest I have been able to locate her in relation to the infinity symbol. She married Robert B. Howard in 1930, becoming part of a large artistic family known as the first family of Bay Area modernism. The Howards were the Bay Area's most productive mid-century artistic clan, which included Charles Howard, Madge Knight, John Langley Howard, Robert Howard, Henry Temple Howard, and Jane Berlin-Dina. And John Galen Howard, who was the father of the Howard children, was the architect of the UC Berkeley campus, and he made the renowned Campanile. This sculpture is the only known self-portrait that Kent made. That she chose to render her likeness in terracotta, a natural material that is molded instead of cast, is significant. She considered herself primarily a sculptor, although she made works on paper and other diverse media. This work is a transitional work that shows her moving away from a naturalistic style and gravitating more towards abstraction. The features she gave herself are simplified and somewhat archaic looking, resembling a prehistoric statue or mask, an homage to an ancient art form she revered. She coarsely treated the surface of the terracotta to make it look as if it was aged stone. Greatly inspired by art from diverse ancient cultures such as Mayan, Egyptian, Asian, and Greek, Kent sought to inject an aspect of the present into aesthetic qualities she considered to be timeless. She wrote, "In the most reposed Buddha, there is a sense of infinity, all of time. This is true in lesser degree for all good sculpture, whether it presents the movement of a dance, the study of a particular person, or some essence of nature carried out in abstraction. The time element is inherent." The mountains were a place that Adaline Kent visited regularly for artistic inspiration and rejuvenation. And here you see her at Kearsarge Pass in Kings Canyon National Park. In fact, she referred to herself as an addict of the High Sierra. She and her husband, Robert B. Howard, spent months at a time in the summer venturing into the craggy terrains and higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada mountains, with their experiences and discoveries informing the objects that they produced. Guided by her love for the natural environment, Kent made inventive abstract sculptures, drawings, and uniquely incised paintings that merge her deep interest in the organic world with her steadfast pursuit of authenticity. She wrote down many of her ideas on art and nature, filling notebooks and scraps of paper with her thoughts. And the subtitle of the exhibition takes its inspiration from this poetic note that Kent wrote on April 17th, 1945. "There is the order within, the rhythm of the mind, beating of time in the heart. A thing is nothing without its own existence. To make things that are beings, ideas which are beings, to find the way leading to the disclosure of beings, the disclosure, presentation of fresh beings. Don't say creation, because there must be about them an air of inevitable presence, timeless existence around the present, a revelation. the capture of a living idea, beings independent of their deceptive, ordinary, frequent appearance, freed from trappings of convention, of the flat eye. Things across time. I want to hear the click of authenticity. I liken the click of authenticity to being the light bulb that goes off in her mind when she has a great idea, or the satisfaction she feels when she has made a successful, inventive work of art. Robert Howard often brought his film camera along to the High Sierra, and the couple took turns recording their adventures. Here you see film stills from some of those films. And I love the one of her resting on the rock with this infinite mountain range behind her. They captured in lush Kodachrome film the many natural wonders they encountered: hummingbirds drinking from flowers, gnarled branches, waterfalls, and their wide open vistas. From her trips to the higher elevations, Kent typically brought back many items she had collected: striated rocks, scraps of metal, rusty nails, shells, weathered branches, and fragments of obsidian. Her daughter, Galen, recalls that these discoveries were then displayed in the family home in Kentfield in exhibitions, where Kent would tell stories about them and share them with other family members. In these two drawings, you see the transition from naturalism to abstraction in two different drawings of Sierra peaks. Kent did a suite of drawings in 1944 that focus on the synthesis of time, waterfalls, and mountaintops. In these works, the infinity symbol appears above as if resting atop two summits, and then continues downward vertically in a line that flows to the base, like water streaming down frozen elevations and into lush valleys. Kent applied this infinity symbol to many different works after this series. And this was really her signature motif, I think, that she developed. Whoops. In this picture, carved from hydrocal, it reads like an abstract mental map of an alpine lake, perhaps Ducie Basin or Coit Peak and Alger Lakes, which Kent sketched in her notebooks during her mountaintop adventures. The eyes rove around the incisions that encircle the composition to see new discoveries along the path, such as crystalline rock formations, waterfalls, abstract renderings of trees, petroglyphs, and hills. Kent would have needed to have a design already in mind in order to execute it before the plaster dried. Her hydrocal paintings, in my opinion, are among her most authentic and innovative works, and they really are singular in the history of modern art. For Kent, the infinite was the wellspring of growth and knowledge that led her to the discovery of her truth. It was what she experienced in the mountains, and it was what she hoped to express in her art. And in this picture, you see, again, the infinity symbol resting above two peaks as stars are twinkling above. And beneath the symbol, again, you have this fountain that appears almost frozen in time as crescent moons fall on each side. In Writ, an infinity symbol hovers in the sky above a star and beneath a star, and circles that resemble the sun and moon or planets. An assembly of people, trees, and objects appears in a mountainous landscape below. On the left side, an Ionic column associated with classical Greek architecture stands upright like a beacon. The scene has a mystical or cosmic tone, as if it were a spiritual rite or vision. On infinity and her experience in the mountains, Kent wrote, "Floating in space-time, passing on our way, we encounter stars made up of intersections of lines of experience that have touched us, ideas, knowledge, memory, premonition, personality. They may come in from an infinity of direction." In her winter landscape series, she evokes the curvature of the infinity symbol and then overlays rectilinear forms and peaks of mountains, as well as trees and other crystalline forms. By 1945, Kent was working almost entirely in an abstract style. In this sculpture, one detects the underlying shape of a mountain or peak, yet the holes she punctured into the hydrocal medium allude to her interest in the infinity symbol and the experience of timelessness she identified with being in the mountains. Kent preferred to work with hydrocal, what she referred to as delicious stuff, because it was less fragile than softer mediums, such as plaster of Paris. The two apertures at the top of this work slope downward in gentle curves, forming a figure 8. The undulations connect the upper section to the lower area where a third aperture rests at the base, perhaps demonstrating deep time or infinity embedded in the mountain itself. The emphasis and linearity also appears in the colorful incisions that elegantly wrap around the structure, echoing the flow of water. Kent painted the sculpture black so that it would appear more like granite. In Link, Kent realized a three-dimensional infinity symbol in terracotta. The infinity symbol was a defining motif in Kent's work, a marker of her authentic style and approach. It served as a representational embodiment, an amalgamation of nature, abstraction, and time, and its many forms in her art. Movement was something that Adaline Kent appreciated in sculpture, and realizing the rhythms of her own body in space and time was likewise an important dimension of her artistic practice. She kept gymnastic rings hanging in her studio that she used skillfully and often for inspiration. Physical movement, whether skiing or hiking in the mountains, dancing, biking across France, or practicing on her rings, was something she thought about in relation to her art. She likened movement to an expression of time in both 2- and 3-dimensional forms. She sought to make work that visually and aesthetically vibrated, as she said. Kent believed, however, that movement must be tempered by balance. The fusion of movement and balance produced a timeless quality in her art. In a lecture she gave on sculpture in 1944 at San Francisco's Legion of Honor, she noted, "From a purely physical point of view, a thing in 3 dimensions must have balance, equilibrium, so that it holds its place in space. In a mobile, it is balance that defines forms in space, traces movements. Sculpture must have balance aesthetically, too, so that the whole is interesting, not just a spot here or there." Her gymnast rings also evoke the infinity symbol, especially when connected to Kent's own arms. For Kent, the infinity symbol also denotes movement. Kent made this monumental work on paper after a well-known poem by the English author John Donne, who lived from 1572 to 1631. He was now considered the father of metaphysical poetry. His text became popular again in the 1920s and 30s when modern poets such as T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats rediscovered his writings, admiring his unique ability to fuse feeling and intellect. Eliot, in particular, considered Donne to be among the most authentic of poets due to the obscure, challenging nature of his verse. Donne once wrote, "Tap a human and they ring with the sound of infinity." Kent must have been inspired by Donne's descriptions of the infinite and superinfinite, referring to an unimaginable space that we can capture and carry with us. Donne's poem Song, also known as Go and Catch a Falling Star, entreats the reader to do the impossible and along the way take inspiration from ancient mythical subjects that inform the present day, as well as, quote, advance an honest mind. This would have spoken to Kent as an artist and adventurer of the High Sierra, and it clearly inspired her to transform the poem into this grand-scale painting. In this work, cast in lead, Journey by the Moon, I envision Kent straddling two peaks, arms outstretched, reaching for infinity. I suppose it too could be considered a kind of self-portrait. The most abstract manifestation of the symbol occurs in this work, Finder, the largest sculpture Kent made from two separate pieces of magnesite. The top piece, an outstretched horizontal with repeating ovular shapes, echoes the curves of the lemnis gate, or the infinity symbol. It seemingly balances above another supporting structure with two ridges that descend in angular verticals and converge in the midsection, ultimately widening at the base. Here it seems as if the infinity symbol balances again above two mountain peaks. The sculpture also vaguely resembles an antenna, which aptly conjures her search for inspiration on mountaintops from an infinity of direction. Infinity was not only a symbol for Kent, but also an experience she felt in time and space, resting above the peaks of the High Sierra. She wrote, "Far from appearances, there is a core order, the center of everything where art, God, magic, soul, thought are one. Directions which it can be tapped or reached are infinite. Once reached, it provides a universal understanding of clear, unprejudiced people, a power of being understood by those. Work coming from there is truth, or true art, indestructible." Through her artwork, she transcended earthly experience and ventured into the infinite. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to introduce Jeff Gunderson. Jeff Gunderson has been the librarian and archivist at the San Francisco Art Institute since 1981. He has written on the history of California photography, the San Francisco art scene of the 1940s, and lectured on artists such as Joan Brown, Elmer Bischoff, Ed Ruscha, Charles Howard, the history of LGBTQ art in San Francisco, the history of Bay Area conceptual art, and the influence of art libraries on artists. He is currently working on a collection of essays about open water swimming. Please welcome Jeff Gunderson.
Thank you, Apsara. Thank you to the museum for putting on this show. It's absolutely terrific. Adaline Kent's life coincided with an explosion of interest in contemporary and modern art in Northern California. Triggering this was the art exhibit at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, which included selections from the groundbreaking Armory show in New York City. Also exhibited was the first showing of the Italian Futurists in America. Civic plans quickly formed to build the California Palace of the Legion of Honor, as well as a new facility for the California School of Fine Arts. And most importantly, there were plans to develop a museum of contemporary art under the auspices of what is now the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. All of this was delayed by World War I. But by the time that Adaline Kent returned from Vassar in 1923 to her Marin County home and had enrolled at the California School of Fine Arts, things were in full swing. Kent's fellow art school students included Ruth Cravath, Maxine Albro, Victor Arnatoff, Yun Ji, Mickey Hayakawa, Squire Knowles, and Zygmunt Sasevich. This cohort would continue as lifelong artists, and many remained close friends with Kent for the rest of her life. Kent crossed paths with teachers like Gottardo Piazzoni, the Dean of Modernist Painting in San Francisco, and studied sculpture with her mentor, Ralph Stackpole. Both of these artists had traveled to Paris and returned to San Francisco as key contributors to the rise of modern art in the Bay Area. Adeline's schoolmates were close, as illustrated by scrapbook evidence like the sculpture class loafing, and photos of swimming, clowning around, and constructing human pyramids at Adaline Kent's picnic in Kentfield. And there's Addie, the nimble athlete atop the pyramid with only her legs in the photo. Yun Ji was one of those fellow students who had organized the Chinese Revolutionary Artists Club. Yun was admired for his modernist paintings and his association with artist-run exhibition spaces. These galleries were located in a cluster of buildings along Montgomery Street, where the Transamerica building stands today, and it was known affectionately by the artists as the Monkey Block. The neighborhood housed dozens of artist studios, a produce market with Chinatown just up the hill, North Beach up Columbus Avenue, and the financial district a couple blocks to the south and east. It was truly the city's bohemian heart. The main building was constructed in 1853 and is where Mark Twain and Bret Harte lived in the mid-19th century. By the 1920s, there were legions of noted local artists with studios. Some of the old guard who had embraced the new ideas of modernism, like Maynard Dixon, Piazzoni, Lucien Lebeau, and Benny Buffano. The new guard was represented by people like Adaline Kent, who was part of the rebellious young artists, along with Dora Bothwell, Jacques Schneer, Bob Howard, Sargent Johnson, and Yun Ji. The epicenter of the Monkey Block in the 1920s and 30s was Ralph Stackpole's Stone Yard, where the photographer Dorothea Lange had a studio upstairs. When poet Kenneth Rexroth arrived in San Francisco, he reported that Stackpole knew everybody in town from top to bottom. He had been out in the world. His appetite for people and ideas was extraordinarily alive and alert. Openings at artist-run galleries would spill out into Stackpole's Stone Yard to accommodate dancing and Prohibition-era violations. Northern California and the Monkey Block was a destination for international artists. Henri Matisse visited, where he reconnected with artists he had met in Paris, including Stackpole, who hosted a banquet for Matisse. The party was attended by leaders of the local art colony, which featured deadly cocktails and 5 gallons of red wine. Artist Esther Bruton observed that Matisse did not drink alcohol and was a vegetarian and would not eat the chicken dinner brought in from a nearby restaurant. According to artist Dora Bothwell, Matisse sat at the head of a U-shaped table. French speakers were seated on one side of the table and non-French speaking guests on the other. One of the French speakers was Adaline Kent, who must have discussed with Matisse how they had both studied in Paris with the French sculptor Antoine Bourdelle. San Francisco artists in the 1920s and 30s encountered a great patron with the San Francisco architect Timothy Pfluger. When Pfluger designed his Pacific Stock Exchange building and tower, he wanted to make sure to create a structure ornamented with pure artwork. Ralph Stackpole provided Pfluger with a list of artists that included Adaline Kent and her friends, all artists from the Montgomery Street studios. The project's artists also include Ruth Cravath, Bob Howard, and the 3 Bruton sisters, Margaret, Esther, and Helen. Kent's 2 sculptures, Nightclub and Saxophone Player, were done in travertine marble, and here she is working on it. It was a new medium to her, which she described as like working on a mouthful of bad teeth. She was particularly impressed when Pfluger paid the artist not according to reputation, but impartially by the square foot. Kent's commission for the Pacific Stock Exchange confirmed her acceptance as one of the dynamic artists bringing new ideas and modernism to San Francisco. The Stock Exchange, its exterior greeted visitors with 2 100-ton granite pylon sculptures by Stackpole, Woman in Produce and Man in Industry. The highlight of the interior was Diego Rivera's massive Allegory of California mural. It was Stackpole who insisted that Timothy Pfluger, Stackpole is on the right here and Pfluger is next to him, but it was Stackpole who insisted that Pfluger include his friend Diego Rivera on the project. While staying in San Francisco, Rivera and his wife Frida Kahlo lived in the studio above Stackpole's stone yard, immersing themselves in the social and artistic life with Adaline Kent and other San Franciscan artists during their 6-month stay in the city. Victor Arnautoff, who had just returned from Mexico where he'd been working with Rivera, reported that he wanted to paint a fresco to decorate his Montgomery Street studio and wanted to see the faces of his friends around him. The scene included Adaline Kent, who is shown here in a white shirt in the middle of the mural, and many of their mutual friends from their student days at the California School of Fine Arts. Montgomery Street artists organized drawing groups, one of which consisted of Adaline, Bob Howard, Bob's brother, John Langley Howard, the sculptor Jacques Schneer, and the very young painter David Park. Park would go on to be the major influence in the Bay Area figurative movement some 2 decades later. By this time, Adaline Kent and Bob Howard had worked on projects together, exhibited together, and were married in August of 1930. And this will be repetitive, I'm sorry. But Kent and Howard had plenty in common. They both came from these prominent Bay Area families, as Howard's father was the architect at the University of California. Bob Howard, after serving as a motorcycle courier in Europe during World War I, he settled in France. His artist friends in Paris included Californians, Alexander Calder and Clay Spahn. And it was Spahn who had encouraged Calder to make things in wire. 2 of Howard's brothers, John Langley and Charles, were painters, and another brother, Henry, was an architect. The family in-laws would soon include those artists Madge Knight, Jane Berlandina, Blanche Phillips, and of course Adaline Kent, resulting in them eventually being noted as that first family of Bay Area modernism, as evidenced from this catalog from the Berkeley Art Museum from a number of years ago. In the spring of 1931, Diego Rivera was one of the jurors, along with his friend Ralph Stackpole, for the San Francisco Art Association's 53rd annual exhibition, where the 2 top sculpture winners were Adaline Kent for this ebony figure and the African-American artist Sergeant Johnson for his terracotta Chester. The very first New Deal WPA art project was located in San Francisco's newly constructed Coit Tower. Although Kent was not one of the commissioned artists, her brother-in-law Henry was one of the architects for the building, and brother-in-law John Langley Howard was one of the artists of the controversial murals. This one is Lang's California industrial scene with the striking workers on the left. The project was organized by Victor Arnautoff, who contributed this cityscape at the corner of Montgomery and Washington Streets, showing the heart of the artist studios in the Monkey Block. Jane Berlandina, one of Kent's closest friends and Henry Howard's wife, was one of the Coit Tower muralists. She had studied in Paris, briefly with Henri Matisse. She was also an art historian who taught at the California School of Fine Arts. Berlandina used egg tempera to paint her home life mural at Coit Tower, resulting in a more dreamlike image than those of the other muralists. And Kent assisted with her sister-in-law's mural. And in the exhibition downstairs, you'll be able to see Kent's 1932 terracotta sculpture of Jane. This was a very close-knit group of artists. In this picture, outside Coit Tower, many are gathered as Maxine Albro reads a manifesto demonstrating their concern over the destruction of their friend Diego Rivera's murals at the Rockefeller Center in New York. Opportunities expanded for these artists with the opening exhibition of the San Francisco Museum of Art, which was orchestrated by their new director, Grace McCann Morley. Morley was a friend of Adaline Kent's and an advocate of women artists. Morley wanted to make sure the museum stayed close to the growing edge of creative art. She did this by mixing a great assortment of wonderful local artists with international shows and traveling exhibits from the New York Museum of Modern Art. She included art photography with the advice from the local Ansel Adams, and initiated a film program, kept the museum open until 10 p.m., incorporated jazz. The museum was truly an artist's museum. Under Morley's direction, Picasso's Guernica was displayed publicly for the very first time in August and September of 1939, exactly at the start of World War II. The Golden Gate International Exhibition on Treasure Island offered yet another exceptional opportunity for Bay Area artists to come together and demonstrate their artistic talents. Here it is floating in the middle of San Francisco Bay in 1939. Ralph Stackpole's monumental Pacifica greeted the public, and again it was architect Timothy Pfluger who advocated for artists' engagement. The court of Pacifica, with its Pacific Unity sculptures surrounding the fountain, were done by Kent, Helen Phillips, Jacques Schneer, the Bruton sisters, and Sergeant Johnson. The Golden Gate International Exhibition included the return of Rivera to rejoin his friends, as well as paint his mural, Pan-American Unity. By the late 1930s, Kent would make wintertime visits to Donner Pass with their friend, ski legend Hans Schroll. Let's see here. Wow, where did that slide come from? I'm having oh well, we get to see a bunch of Sugar Bowl images at the same time. God, I'm not capable of this kind of presentation, so you know I'll accept it though. But he did the Hans Schroll, who was the founder of Sugar Bowl. Kent and Howard became stockholders in this winter resort, where brother-in-law Henry Howard had designed this chairlift that you're seeing more images of than I had anticipated. But this is the first chairlift in California, and where architect friend William Worcester designed that lodge with its signature sloping roof. One of their fellow Sugar Bowl investors was Walt Disney, who had taken ski instruction from Schroll in Yosemite. And Disney used the site as the location for the 1941 Art of Skiing cartoon starring Goofy, which may have been Disney's alter ego when you think about it. At nearly the same time, artist and mosaicist extraordinaire Jean Renault would become one of Kent's closest friends, and she had set up her studio in Soda Springs, just 2 miles from Sugar Bowl. Renault associated with the Surrealists. Her close friends included André Breton, Isamu Noguchi, and Gorky. She had purchased a 1941 Jackson Pollock painting and encouraged her friend Grace McCann Morley to purchase similar work for the San Francisco Museum. Bay Area artists were soon joined by a set of artists from Europe, expats, who had returned to the U.S. to escape the war. After spending most of the 1930s in England, brother-in-law Charles Howard and his artist wife Madge Knight returned to San Francisco, along with Stanley Hayter and his new wife, Helen Phillips. San Francisco journalists exclaimed that with the darkness over Europe, San Francisco may well inherit the ancient mantle of Paris as the world's new center of arts and letters. Helen Phillips and Kent became close friends. According to Time magazine, the blue-eyed, honeyed-haired Phillips had studied under the sympathetic eye of sculptor Ralph Stackpole in that stone yard, whose vigorous, massive modernism she found much to her liking. The presence of the expat artists and the war in Europe had an immediate impact on local artists. Charles Howard's first war winter won the San Francisco Museum of Art's Purchase Prize in 1940. Charles Howard galvanized the Bay Area art scene. Morley also encouraged museum programming designed to distract audiences from the upheaval of war, with supporting her new curator Douglas McKagie's new vision for a circus-themed exhibit, Sawdust and Spangles, complete with posters and sideshows. Bob Howard's Mobiles and Acrobats was pitched under the big top in the museum's rotunda. Artists included David Park, Charles Howard, Madge Knight, Clay Spahn, and of course, with her interest in trapeze and gymnastics, Adaline Kent, who exhibited 2 pieces, juggler and tightrope walker. Kent's circus athleticism is evident in her studio with gymnastic rings for her daily workouts. Kent and Howard's studios were on Francisco Street, just a few blocks from the California School of Fine Arts, where Howard taught sculpture after the war and where Adaline was on the board. Visiting faculty during the summers included artists like Adaline Kent's friend Mark Rothko, who taught in 1947 and 1949. Rothko would stay at Kent's and Howard's home, which was at the corner of Francisco and Leavenworth, across the street from the school, while they were traveling in the Sierra Nevada, as it should be described here. In 1948, Kent exhibited Truth to Tell in Germaine McKagie's Legion of Honor exhibition, Mobiles and Articulated Sculpture. Kent described her piece as a black papier-mâché roly thing. Germaine McKagie was particularly pleased with Kent's work, describing it as a witty sculpture. No matter how hard rocked, it defies any attempt to knock it over. The New York Times thought it a successful experiment in abstract form, tensions, and balance. Other artists included Bob Howard, along with their friends Alexander Calder, Claire Falkenstein, and Clay Spahn, who exhibited Unnamed Object. The social and artistic life in San Francisco found a home at the school in the late 1940s, with parties like The Unknown, which drew its inspiration from a theme concocted by Clay Spahn and Mark Rothko. The flyer hustled supper, bar, distractions, dancing. The San Francisco Examiner reported that Addie Kent wore a black leotard covered in moss and leaves, while 2 bands thumped out hot jazz, and nobody went to the hospital or jail. One of the distractions was Spahn's Museum of Little-Known and Unknown Objects, which consisted of enigmatic fugitive material that were assembled with the assistance of Kent and Richard Diebenkorn. Here is Kent, front and center, with the beginnings of what would become beat-era funk Dada art of the 1950s San Francisco. A new influx of surrealist artists arrived in the Bay Area in the late 1940s and early 50s. Gordon Onslow Ford, Lee Mulliken, Wolfgang Paulin, and Luchita Hurtado, located near Gene Varda's Vallejo ferry boat at Sausalito's Gate 5 houseboat community. Included in Varda's circle were not only Adaline Kent and Bob Howard, but also filmmakers Sidney Peterson, James Broughton, and Frank Stoffaker, philosopher Alan Watts, poets Kenneth Rexroth and Philip LaMantia, and avant-garde composer Harry Partch. Varda's Vallejo ferry boat was a magnet for a rich blend of artists, poets, writers, philosophers, filmmakers, and bon vivants. Kent's close connections with Onslow Ford and Ruth Asawa and Noguchi motivated her to take a class in calligraphy. Kent wrote to her daughter Galen that this Zen Buddhism is attractive, a way that might conceivably lead toward peace. Kent's letter continued and used a sports metaphor for calligraphy, noting how the pen is one of my favorite tools. When it gets to the point of freedom and discipline, it is something like fencing. Throughout the mid-50s, Kent and Bob Howard kept current with the most avant-garde of San Francisco art happenings, most notably with their connections to the legendary Six Gallery. The Six Gallery is where Allen Ginsberg first read Howl in October 1955. The next month, Bob Howard was included in the Six Gallery's second annual group show. Kent's close connection with the Six Gallery co-founder, the African-American artist Hayward King, who is shown here, is obvious from a letter to her daughter Ellen, who was in Paris in 1955. Kent reminded Ellen to send her best to Hayward, who was on the Fulbright grant studying at the Sorbonne. It must have been difficult for Adaline Kent's close friend, Ellen Branston, to write about her in the past tense in May of 1957. In the May of 1957 San Francisco Art Association newsletter. You were a wiry young girl on a flying trapeze who, when tired of sculpture, would swing on the rings overhead in your studio and barely miss the latest piece of sculpture beneath your feet. The art world was very lucky to have had Adaline Kent. Please enjoy this wonderful exhibition. Thank you.
Okay, and our next presenter is Elaine Yao, Associate Curator of the African American Quilt Collection at BAM PFA, where she's organizing an exhibition from Eli Leon's historic bequest of approximately 3,000 quilts for the fall of 2024. She also co-curated Rosie Lee Tompkins' A Retrospective in 2020, an exhibition that deepened her long-standing engagement with art at the intersection of discourses on folk art, vernacular culture, and modernism. She is published on Gertrude Morgan and Minnie Evans, and her critical essay on folk art was included in the Routledge Companion to African American Art History. She has a PhD from UC Berkeley. Please welcome Elaine.
Good morning, friends, guests, and colleagues, and especially the family of Adaline Kent. Based on my bio, it might be unexpected that I am here, but the connection is really that I was a part of this project in 2018 when Apsara very generously invited me to be her research support and her partner in this. And so it's just really a pleasure to finally be here and see the exhibition to fruition. So today, I'm actually really grateful. Jeff, you went before me because he really set the stage for a few moments in Adaline Kent's career that I'd like to call to the fore, and which you can also see in the exhibition gallery spaces. There are moments that may be lesser known, but which I hope illuminate the extent to which Kent's modernist sensibility was constantly evolving through her engagement with different cultural arenas that were around her at different moments. And these are namely, just so we can track together, the community of San Francisco artists creating art for the Golden Gate International Exposition, responding as an artist in wartime, the opportunities she had in modern landscape design, how she sought deep attunements to nature, and finally, the role of female friendship and advocacy in her career. So to be taken together, I'm really hoping that they reflect how much she was an artist interwoven into the artistic milieu defined by California's landscape, its geography, and its spiritual ethos. So as I said, the first of these moments was set amid the Golden Gate International Exposition on San Francisco's Treasure Island, which opened its gates to visitors under the theme Pacific Unity in 1939. It was organized to mark the openings of the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges, but this exhibition also had the impact of mobilizing scores of architects, engineers, landscapists, and artists during the Great Depression in the creation of a year-long showcase that hailed San Francisco as the gateway to the Pacific and a conduit toward peaceful global relationships. And as Jeff mentioned, Rivera's monumental mural, Pan-American Unity, which is now on view at SF MoMA, is perhaps the best-known artworks from this event. And while the Palace of Fine Arts was the main exhibition space for artists at the exposition, Adaline Kent's work was fully integrated with its architecture and outdoor grounds. And most prominent among them was a three-piece sculpture group entitled Islands of the Pacific that adorned the Fountain of Western Waters in the outdoor court of Pacifica. Here, two female figures entitled Young Girls Resting in the Sun Listening hearken and recline to the music emanating from the third sculpture, known as Young Man Improvising Music, positioned on one of the fountain's upper tiers. And rather than cast the sculptures from clay models, Kent built up the final forms for the Islands of the Pacific trio directly in plaster over metal armatures. The organizers of the exhibition then created more durable cement casts that would ultimately be on display. Artist and UC Berkeley professor Eugen Neuhaus was particularly taken with the male figure when he viewed it in '39, remarking, quote, "It possesses both outer form and inner life. It is more than decorative," end quote. This group joined 20 other sculptures in the court of Pacifica, collectively titled Pacific Unity. And these works, a selection of which you see here, all share a similar stylization that reduces physical particularities of their figures into smooth, streamlined features. And I think this provides the visual unity to all of the distinctive cultures that were being collectively shown. What I find interesting, or perhaps as one might expect from Adaline Kent, who, as we've already heard, sought kernels of truth and presence in her art, her sculpture is not fixated on naming cultures of origin or cultural difference, but on the universally human capacity to produce music, harmonious sound. Kent also produced two bas-relief sculptures that presided over the west arches of the Court of Honor, entitled Air and Water. Unfortunately, these are lost. And Neuhaus noted their eerie quality, he wrote, that gives them the appearance of floating in space rather than being a part of a wall, along with their power to, quote, fascinate by their very unconventionality and daring, end quote. Kent's work would indeed soon take a more daring turn into abstraction shortly after the exposition, and especially with the arrival of her brother-in-law Charles Howard and his wife Madge Knight from London in 1940. And both Howard and Knight had brought with them the lessons of surrealism to the US, lessons that Kent would learn from and adopt into her own artistic practice. With the advent of World War II and the global conflict, Adaline Kent indeed wrestled with her role as an artist in wartime, and this concern emerges dynamically in Monument for Heroes, which you see on the screen. This was Kent's concept for a war memorial dedicated to servicemen and women and was planned for a public park. Though it was never realized, the innovative maquette shows the innovative design. Here, a set of rungs invites climbers to ascend a wall that curves toward a platform where more rungs, which I hope you can see, rise vertically stacked, allowing them to reach the top of the sculpture. And from here, the slide guides them down a spiral that turns both clockwise and counterclockwise, with the turning point just located behind the horizontal landing. So if you can imagine two different spirals interlocking, so you go one way and then you start cascading down the other. As a reviewer for Kent's 1943 solo exhibition at a San Francisco gallery noted, quote, "This colossal slide for adults would swish its riders back and forth as they descend, and the same thrust and counter-thrust of line and volume and force animates much of her more serious work," end quote. In this way, Kent sought to create an experience from the form in space and space in form, as she would write, activated by free but controlled speed, revealing the extent to which her monument was not meant solely for visual contemplation, but for creating participants out of viewers, offering them a chance to feel their bodies in space as well. Kent's friend and fellow sculptor Isamu Noguchi also experimented with interactive features in works around this time, including Play Mountain, Contoured Playground, and the United Nations Playground. There are obvious differences between Kent's and Noguchi's projects, and most notably, we could contrast Kent's contained sculpture with her friend's subtler designs for exploratory play, in which the edges seem to dissolve into the landscape. Nevertheless, each artist worked from a shared belief in the affirmative power of their art to counter the destructive forces of war. In one undated note, Kent wrote that creativity is an opportunity for artists to create and sustain morale for winning this war. You have the power to preserve life instead of death. And similarly, Noguchi urged Kent to stand firm in the context of wartime in another letter, in which he wrote, quote, "We must certainly believe in our own work to the fullest these days, or be sucked into the whirlpool of war activity, which is for some an escape from the lack of any belief. With the suffering and tragedy that besets the world, one needs to be doubly dedicated." A lesson for today. Following her own wartime service, as part of San Francisco's volunteer port security force, Kent explored new materials like hydrocal, a type of casting plaster, to further her interest in abstract idioms. Her most publicized sculpture is arguably here, entitled Island of 1948, which is this third moment I'd like to consider now. This project began in response to landscape architect Thomas D. Church's invitation for a quote-unquote sculptural ornament, as he wrote in the contract, to punctuate a swimming pool for the grounds of Dewey and Jean Donnell's new home in Sonoma, California. While Church's associate Lawrence Halperin wanted to use a granite boulder from the site to adorn the pool, Church insisted on inviting Kent to contribute her concept instead. The resulting sculpture, along with George Rockrise's design for the veranda and the pool house, was a landmark of California modernist design that integrated the natural landscape, architecture, and gardens into a unified aesthetic statement. The pool's biomorphic shape echoed surrealist forms of artists like family member Charles Howard, Jean Arp, architecture, and Noguchi's commercially successful kidney-shaped table of the 1940s, which you can actually still buy today. The pool's appearance on the April 1951 cover of House Beautiful magazine essentially popularized this outdoor living lifestyle inspired by nature, and the free-form pool was a central feature of this lifestyle. With its graceful lines and human proportions, Kent's sculpture, especially as you see it here rising from the surface of the water, recalls her reclining figurative works of the late 1930s. And it also complements the curves of Sonoma Valley hills that rolled across the Donnell's cattle ranch in the back. Other views of the sculpture reveal multiple apertures opening above and below the waterline. And as we saw with Kent's Monument for Heroes, the sculptural features are intended to be activated by full embodied engagement. And here, the island's voids and surfaces are Kent's invitation to swimmers to glide through them or rest upon their welcoming, gentle curves. As Halperin would later reflect, quote, "The sculpture is like a boulder in the Sierra Mountain pool. You can circle it, swim through the hole, or stop in the middle to sunbathe and socialize." Indeed, the sculpture's title, Island, speaks to the artwork's dual status as a discrete material form, but also a physical destination for human exploration that might open up to other kinds of insular and liminal states. Kent's meditations that are situated at the intersection of the natural and built environments shine through a series of terracotta sculptures that she started in the mid-1950s, and there's an entire beautiful gallery dedicated to these works just downstairs. Upon returning from a 3-month trip to Greece, Egypt, and Paris in March of 1954, Adaline Kent began working in a new vein, creating terracotta sculptures that drew inspiration from the ancient artifacts and landscapes that she absorbed on these travels. She was deeply attuned to the interactions of light and shadow, staged by her encounters with archaic ritual objects, the Greek theaters carved into rocky hillsides and the pylons of the Nile Valley. Her new artworks demonstrate how she processed these mysteries as she sensed them, resulting in sculptures that simultaneously recall prehistoric vessels and monumental architecture at once. 4 sculptures from this period containing lighting elements were created as part of a commission for the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite National Park's iconic lodge. 3 of them are visible in this 1964 photograph. Positioned below the Gothic-style wrought iron chandeliers, ceiling stencils inspired by indigenous motifs, and an abstract fireplace mural by Fran Spencer Reynolds, the lamps stand out like quiet sentinels amid the lounge's busy, eclectic decor. And I hope you can, in fact, see them. There's one in the foreground, one right behind the 2 green lounge chairs, and yet a third behind. Great, thank you. Right, so the lamps, yes, they do stand out, I think, amid this busy decor. And this quality, I think, is further heightened when we can compare some of their aesthetic impact to earlier contributions to the hotel by both her husband and brother-in-law, which were commissioned when the Ahwahnee first opened in 1927. And so just for example, you see Robert Howard's mural up top in the upper right. It's his mural in the Great Lounge, which employs a dense floral style of 15th century European tapestries. And I think it's intended here to summon an air of old world majesty for its guests. And then below, we see Henry Temple Howard's floor designs for the hotel lobby, which are also cultural citations, which in this case are his interpretations of indigenous motifs created to acknowledge the First Nations communities that inhabited the park's land. By contrast, Kent's sculptures are much more interested in calling forth atmospheric effects of arguably the most majestic and ancient of the park's features, the rocks formations themselves. And while the commissioned lamps in the 1964 photograph are lost, several related sculptures survive and manifest her attraction to the dramatic interplay of light and elemental forms, some of which impressed her from the Mediterranean, but also from the trails of Yosemite. And in that sense, she once wrote, she was so taken with, quote, the rich, hazy drama of angles and domes in the red sunset, end quote. In Sage, the only existing lamp, natural light activates the sculpture's hollowness through a host of shadows cast by 3 vertical prongs, facets of horizontal strata, and the rugged surface of clay that recalls the mountain's steep crags. Dark voids and cutouts in the other 2 models, for example, the ones at the base of the middle example, or the handle-like appendages on the right, not only heighten the impact of light cast on their conical shapes, but lead viewers to a startling and arresting ambiguity. These sculptures are not simply one thing, but they can be perceived as vessels, caves or shelters for creatures, torches with their light snuffed out, or perhaps objects in service of unknown rituals. Like other terracotta sculptures that Kent was already working on when she accepted this commission, they channel what she once described as, quote, strange images vibrant with life we don't understand in words, end quote. In trying to distill the ineffable into material form, Kent's lamps thus become more than the decorative. They are spiritual explorations of space and worlds that transcend their modest dimensions. In advancing these spiritual dimensions of her art, Kent found an important ally and supporter in Betty Parsons, and this is the last moment I'll be presenting on. Through her legendary gallery and friendship, Parsons played an essential role in bringing Adaline Kent's work to the attention of New York collectors, critics, and museums, and thereby bringing Kent into contact with important figures who were shaping the discourse on modernist abstraction. The 2 women first met in 1924, where Kent's studies at the Grand Chaumier overlapped with Parsons' lengthier residency in Paris. We don't know the extent to which they stayed connected throughout the following decades, but inevitably their social circles would include common artist friends such as Noguchi, Rothko, Clifford Still, and Jean Reynal. Their connections aside, however, the two would form a bond over their shared devotion to abstraction, and in March of 1947, Kent would hand-deliver Universal Compass and Witch to Parsons' gallery that had opened a mere 6 months earlier. These works were among the first of Kent's to enter the gallery's inventory, just as it was established to show the period's foremost modern artists. Parsons would go on to represent Kent for over a decade and organized 4 solo exhibitions on her behalf. The first was held from May 10th to May 10th to the 28th in 1949. No checklist survives, but an inventory of artworks that Kent shipped to New York contains 17 sculptures in media ranging from magnesite, hydrocal, terracotta, bronze, and papier-mâché, and 9 carved drawings on hydrocal. Critic Clement Greenberg was especially taken with Gambler and Ambush, which you see here, in his 1949 review of this show, pointing out the quote-unquote new vitality of sculpture that he observed in her construction of space. The impact of Kent's first show in New York was immediately felt, and she would write to Parsons shortly after the show closed, quote, "Letters have come from long-lost friends on all sides. Truly, I am proud and grateful to be represented in such company. It gives new courage for new work." 2 solo shows followed, one in 1953 and another in the spring of '56. Their correspondence was warm and reveals some of the challenges Kent faced as an artist based in California. On more than one occasion, sculptures would arrive damaged in transit, resulting in extended exchanges with insurance agencies and managing repairs from afar. One also senses a mutual acknowledgement of the missed opportunities to experience New York's art scene together. Nevertheless, Kent would still write, quote, "It's a pest to be so far away, yet I wouldn't trade the quiet work times for all the East," end quote. Kent clearly valued her remove from the bustle of New York, where her cherished mountains, studios, family, and communities resided. In the wake of Kent's tragic death in 1957, Parsons supported the artist's family in ways that showed her deep regard for and belief in Kent's art. From September 22nd to October 11th in 1958, the gallery hosted Kent's memorial exhibition, providing a larger and pared-down space than the show's first venue at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which Robert Howard and Alice Kent felt left the sculptures a bit too crowded. In addition to facilitating loans from private collections and photography for the show's catalog, Betty Parsons sold this sculpture, Citadel, to the Whitney Museum later that year, finally fulfilling one of Kent's aspirations to be represented in that major New York collection. While she worked to extend Kent's memory by placing work in other private and public collections, Parsons personally acquired the sculpture Wellspring of 1955 for her own. This work, and an earlier hydrocal of the same name that you see here, touches on the timeless spiritual fount they found in their shared love of abstract art. And the sculpture in particular, with its generous concavities and voids that we have seen already again and again, characterize this mysterious openness and dynamism that Kent would constantly return to, and which she brought to the fore continually at various turns and opportunities. So I'll leave it there for now and look forward to our discussion to expand on all of these observations. Thank you.
So we are now going to take a brief intermission of about 10 minutes, so you can stretch your legs and go visit the restroom and take a trip out to the sky deck so you can see the beautiful mountains. I invite you to all take your seats while I'm introducing our next speaker. Alexander Nemerov is the Carl and Marilynn Thoma, Provostial Professor in the Arts and Humanities at Stanford University. A scholar of American art, Nemerov writes about the presence of art, the recollection of the past, and the importance of the humanities in our lives today. Nemerov's new book, Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler and 1950s New York, was published by Penguin in 2021 and was a finalist for the 2021 National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography. Other books include Summoning Pearl Harbor from 2017 and Soulmaker, The Times of Lewis Hine from 2016. He is completing his next book, The Forest, A Fable of America in the 1830s, to be published by Princeton University Press, based on the Andrew W. Mellon lectures he gave at the National Gallery in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Nemerov.
Thank you, Apsara, and thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure again to say a few words, and what I'm going to do is just read the essay that I wrote for the catalog, and I'm so grateful again to Apsara for giving me the opportunity to do it. So I'll be interested to hear how it sounds. So it's called The Song of Adaline Kent. Adaline Kent made her sculptures in a studio in San Francisco, but they seem to come from elsewhere, to have landed in our midst. The rising shapes suggest rescued truths and forgotten sayings, moribund gods and resuscitated lore. Theirs is a mountaintop wisdom, the kind preached by saints stripped of their robes, swung round in the light, torquing their bodies in ecstasies rhymed with the quiver of fallen trees. Dead at last, truthful to the sun and moon, and speaking no language known to the everyday world, these sculptures, these beings, as she called them, emerged from across a threshold as no creation of hers, but as discoveries brought back, ferried, carried across in some dream that is not a dream of invention, but a trance that makes heavy things light. She called these sculptures phantoms and visitors. At first, they are meant to scare us, startle us, awaken us from the steady state of common sense. The fear they inspire is not, however, the kind aliens create, a terror of confronting strange creatures the likes of which we have never seen. The fear is instead of something much nearer, namely the truth of our own being, manifest in hard, sinuous forms, shafts of bone and driftwood, spiraled shells and jagged stumps, signs of our own existence manifest in new and familiar forms, the pelvis, jug, and anthill of ourselves. The recognition made, the fear then becomes something else, the steadiness and directness of a person for the first time experiencing the ground beneath their feet. It is the poet's, the artist's gift to us. The philosopher Martin Heidegger said that the poet is someone who ventures forth, that the poet finds what he calls the open, that the poet turns herself unshielded to this openness, and that because she is unshielded, has nothing to fear. Instead of defending behind the circumference of leather and metal, holding up the shield that parries the local thrust of whatever danger is nearest, the poet, the artist, drops the shield and faces the openness undefended, letting the widest orbit, the wide present, Kent called it, enter her heart. Poets, writes Heidegger, are the sayers who more sayingly say. in her sculptures, Kent speaks of ourselves. Are the sculptures angels? If so, all the angels are different. They are not the serried ranks of seraphim flanking the throne in an altarpiece, each fanning iridescent wings and glowing in burnished gold. Kent's angels are instead Miltonic, coarse and smooth as the cooled stone of comets. We approach them awkwardly in concert with their peculiar being and ours. They are the clues to a ritual we cannot name, a king's scepter held aloft of its own accord, a chalice raised for a toast, miracles so strange we do not know whether to drink from them or bow before them or lift or hold or play their musical silence. And this strangeness we come to see is the point. For no one who carries the word back from the mountain claims that the sacred cup is not also a jester's cap, that the crown is not also a rotten trunk. Beyond the sports of nature, the rocks and hills and trees that accidentally resemble something we know, each sculpture arrives back at some unity of grace and body, air and clay, whose strange heraldry is the angel's array. If loathsome mud reflects the stars, then the voids in Kent's work are the same as the solids. The interplays of negative and positive space, the homely, sensuous shapes, raise all existence to a decree. An enunciation of heaven and earth, beating wings and pulsing heart, risen from the ground where life starts. What comes forth is not from Genesis or any other sacred book. It is a privacy of faith, a miracle of elbows and knees, of spines and soft lines, the momentary contortions of individual experience. It is toward the prospect of 1,000 such encounters with you, with me, with anybody, that the art raises itself up in expectation of a greeting, a ceremony, some time, whose light will be a light aloft. Actuality, wrote the art historian George Kubler, is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes. We may watch the light from the lighthouse to determine our course, but actuality is what passes and exists without us perceiving it. It is the steady beat of the silence and hiddenness that drums in our bodies and in the world. Kent sought this actuality in her work. Sculpture, she wrote, is an adventure into the unknown, a portrayal of natural memory, prophecy, actuality. Her lighthouse for birds offers no beacon, only a promise, a sign of light without the light itself, manifest in clay, a roosting spot, a haven, a gathering place among the restless migrations. It reveals to us our mortality and the place of that mortality in the universe, our fate to be swung round with the rocks and trees, pebbles orbiting in the fantastic scheme. It is a truth best left untold, unless it be for the one who cares to see, that actuality is the darkness between strobes, the watch between ticks, the heart before and after a beat. Then another kind of light goes on, an inward summoning for all of us, and we get a dark taste of another sun, the light that makes us ourselves into beams and shapes and designs, totems of our own lives, ecstatic and angel-like visitors to our own experience on earth. Touching down on tripods and claws, Kent's sculptures explore the ground as a newborn place. That little piece of ground is all they need. Command is foreign to their certitude. They make no territorial claim of space. No conqueror on a horse extends a martial hand of vanquishment, the town square quavering in submission. The area around her sculptures remains gentle, the same. Each sculpture is an isolation, a solitude concentrated where it lightly touches ground, as gently as a rocking cradle atop spinning on a table. What channels the sky to the ground is likewise not found. Lyric in their turns, the sculptures plant no flags, but make the humble earth itself stand, lifting it up, giving it pliant shape in a circulation whose gravity is like the sap pumping through the tree. The person who goes to the mountaintop, who draws the jagged rocks, who listens to the music and watches the bush explode into flames, experiences the world as a saint. A calling beckons her, a vocation, a voice. What is the nature of it? St. Francis heard the skylark lift its praise to God every morning before it sank back to earth. In Kent's works, the notes rise like smoke from a campfire, like water down a cliff. The music curls and squirms like worms in a bucket. The sun and moon also speak in the ferment. We cannot discern if the music is theirs or ours. Lyric enchantment belongs both to the world and the one who sings. And it is the nature of the notes, the playing of the sounds, that they spin these sounds in thin air, gather in trees, and come down again in pollinations and rain. The rotten branch, the squelched sand, the leaf pressed in mud. The priestess sings until she cannot see, and when she is sufficiently blind, when her sense of touch is perceptibly heightened, when the erotic stoniness begins slipping and forming in her hands, then the world awakens in shapes of a sufficient distinctness that it does not matter whether the incantation was hers, theirs, or no one's at all. Only animals, says the poet Rainer Maria Rilke in the 8th of his Juno elegies, only animals experience the world in its openness. We don't. Only animals are without future and past and entirely in the moment and place of their existence all the time. Human beings, by contrast, well, we must remain outside the world. Animals can survey it from afar, or rather we as human beings can survey it from afar like those mountains out the window, but we can never really be in the world. It's just, that's what it is. That's what Rilke says. And, you know, a sculpture is seemingly one of these things fated to be apart, to be an affair only of distance. We're here, we look at it, it's over there. But Kent's work aspires against the rule. It gathers the openness of the world, for example, those mountains there, like string around spools, like water shaping stone. Her sculptures aim to be a kind of wisdom, a fullness and repleteness akin to the low-slung animals on the ground, the bats in air or the caterpillars on the leaf, that kind of wisdom. Not as vessels of the openness, not as containers of the earth. Kent's work is the earth in the way a creature might experience it, as the slippage between one thing and the next, the fluidity of wood and bone, loam and stone, experienced so closely that beyond the given spot, beyond the antler cocked in the snow, there is no universe other than the one we know. The sculptures, like this one, neither move nor are still. They take from the snake and the slowness of the sundial, the creeping shadow and the spider's tread. They make all motions one in a stream of forms. But they also remain true to immobility, and devoutly so, as if kinetics were only a byword, a catechism for the exploration of a finer poise, that of a trapeze artist in motionless sway, a balancer on a beam. The poet, the artist, composes forces, keeps them in suspense, creating the illusion, for such it is, that movement is actually but a finer form of stillness, and that stillness itself, if looked at closely, vibrates with action. Time is what this is sometimes called. The motion of bodies and things over moments and over eons, the river carving the shore, the dead tree on the forest floor, the centipede's speed, and the falcon's slow swoop. All of it, it turns out, is the same. All of it gathers in a work without compass, without coordinates. The dancers spin when the dance begins. And who pays court in the castle of this fantasy? We see the relics, the offerings, the objects of a natural religion, the kind the Sierra Club and a faith in art would seem to endorse. If one or both of these dreams may not be ours, then nothing really keeps us from seeing Kent's sculptures as just period pieces and keeping them true to our distanced nature as at arm's length. These works we might acknowledge when we're being smart and superior, might hold the breath of a lost piper, and that piper might have breathed the finest air, sure, but the custom of the world, our custom, is to muffle that living sound and make it the stuff of only chronological time, like some stuff that happened a long time ago. An era and place over there, the stuff of a merely courteous, then on our part, a merely courteous or historical interest. Like, that's so interesting. After all, since we're logical, skeptical, rational beings and we run our lives just so, no feint toward sacredness really need distract us. We're all too savvy, aren't we, for pagan ritual, for a faith of flowers and birds and the ancientness of ourselves. And to put it another way, as always in our lives, whether it's looking at art or mountains or anything, the word no is the strongest. But this no, I've come to see, is a necessary stage, just a stage. It's a requirement even for any believer, including Kent herself, who might say at first and perhaps for a long time, I don't believe. Each of her works, as it were, must go through a bad dream, a nightmare of gloom and doubt and no truth at all, of being an imposter, in her word, in order to emerge as something new and strange. There's got to be a lot of no involved. And what I've come to understand is that only by disappearing into the changing room of these disguises, fashions, cloaks, and gowns can the work appear finally more securely as an instance in a great gallery of nudes, unashamed, finally, as we might all be in the light of day. Only by unwrapping peeling back all the style, the glamour, the meaningless talk of technique, might the artist reveal the earth and ourselves as we are. Unwrap, as the painter Mikhailov thinks to himself in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, when he reflects that he must remove the wrappings from his subjects, that the defects of his art arose when he was too careless in removing the wrappings. Kent herself put it this way: unwrap things to the core. So there finally is only a core, not just for the object, but for us. Unwrap things to the core, she said, and the spirit of emptiness, which is depression, meaninglessness, ordinariness, that will, she says, go to the other side. You could say, will magically kind of be vanquished. And that is why, spun from meaninglessness, from that word no, Kent's works spiral with signs of more than the world's lack of design. She rolled the stone with Camus' Sisyphus. She pushed the boulder uphill each day, just like any artist entering the studio. But with her, something strange happened. The stone took on a tone of its own, became a sensation that outlived toil and the grim effort to give that toil its own nobility. Kent confronted the emptiness, looked it in the eye, and sought destinations beyond the meaninglessness of the daily round. Back to where we started we may go, but we return changed by the fantasy, swimming a little still with a voyage that is not consolation for a cold truth, but a lasting dream of a burden lifted. A lasting dream of a burden lifted. What if there were a kind of enchantment in life? What if? Burnishing her art with the lucidity of disbelief, Kent worked her nearly featureless materials, absorbing the rational light of despair until her art glowed from within. This is her yes. And if we too were to say yes, and if this yes were to be something like the word ensconced in James Joyce's Ulysses, yes, I said, yes, I will, yes, goes the end of that book. If we were to open ourselves to the work in the way that it opens to us, and here's Joyce, and then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes, and then he asked me, would I, yes, to say yes. If the work aspired to get us to this yes, and remember, habitually we say no, what in this case would our consent mean? It seems to me that's the question. Here's my answer. We would surrender our self-regard, silence the knocks and knee-jerks of reaction, and be for a moment bent before the lyric of the world, manifest not in sea and sky, but in these emissaries, these visitors, phantoms, intruders. We would see that they are the nowhere we have never been, that coming home to us is true to who we are. We would see that they are the nowhere we have never been, that coming home to us is true to who we are. The arm holds the scepter, the elbow bends, the crown descends, the guard drops, and the fortress declines. Something breaks in the protocols of strength. The work disarms, speaks a kind of peace. There is a humility in the stars. It is ours. Thank you.
You all taking that in? Okay, I'm going to introduce our final speaker, and as I introduce her, I'm going to invite all of our speakers to come up on stage. Jenny Sorkin is Professor of Art and Architecture at UC Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art. In 2021, Thames and Hudson published her most recent book, Art in California, as part of the acclaimed World of Art series. Her first book, Live Form, Women's Ceramics and Community, from the University of Chicago Press, 2016, examined the confluence of gender, artistic labor, and the history of post-war ceramics. She has contributed to numerous publications, journals, and exhibition catalogs. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Sorkin.
Thank you. Wait, you want me to sit? I was going to start. Okay, when I'm done. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Apsara, and to all my fellow panelists. Apsara has asked me to do what we call in academia being a respondent, which means doing a little work of summarizing some of the papers that come before as a way of refreshing everybody's memory here of since it's been kind of a long morning. And then that will lead us into our discussion and I'll take my seat here. So Apsara is the first curator to characterize Adaline Kent's practice and its content through a deeply researched exhibition and through careful archival work. She traces the symbolism of infinity out throughout Kent's oeuvre as a locus for thinking through the space-time continuum that is endemic to art historical thought. I was also struck by the sort of ephemerality of Kent's materials that reoccur, the hydrocal, which is a kind of plaster, paper mache, the hydrocal made to look like granite but is not granite, the constant breakage or sort of warping in the shipping of materials across the country or finished pieces, and the kind of ephemeral practice then in which the oeuvre feels sometimes incomplete or not fully realized into bigger monumental forms of sculpture that perhaps Kent's peers and even her husband were asked to do in more monumental and public spaces. That perhaps if she had lived longer, she would have had the opportunity to work publicly or to become a kind of public artist in a way that wasn't possible at the height of her practice in the 30s and 40s due to both the Great Depression and the sort of lack of possibility and the lack of access to materials during World War II. I think what's also important to mention here is that as you saw, and I'll make this point, through Jeff's archival paper was really great at sort of giving us a foundation. But one of the sort of issues with Bay Area abstraction and Bay Area art history is that it's work that is endlessly historicized only in the Bay Area. This is one of the problems of the so-called regionalism that has been attributed to the San Francisco milieu of the pre-war period, which I don't think is true, and there's lots of intersections that happen. But doing this show here in Nevada means to me a kind of expansion and endless possibility moving outward. Nevada itself is full of California transplants. There's a kind of intersection between the two states, a long intertwined history, and it seems especially fitting to hold this show here and think about future possibilities for how Kent's work might fit into the larger milieu of the High Sierra landscape here. Jeff Gunderson offered the milieu and history of the early 20th century San Francisco art scene through an enormous and really powerful collection of images that I said to him on the side, this is really hard to see. I wish I had access to all of your images because it's hard to find that material. And as working as an archivist and librarian for a really long period of time, I think that we will ask Jeff, but one becomes inured or forgets the kind of spectacular amount of ephemera and imagery that one gets to see or sift through on a kind of weekly basis. What he did in his paper in particular is showcase the San Francisco art scene internationalizing in the pre-war period, starting with the 1915 Panama Pacific exhibition and all the plans that fell into place as a way to make both an art school, the California School of Fine Arts, and a museum, the California Palace of Legion of Honor, which was built specifically for that exhibition and then remains one of the primary museum spaces in the aftermath of the show. But he shows the visits and interactions with Diego Rivera and Henri Matisse, and also points to a kind of integrated space where white bohemians like Kent and her husband Charles Howard mingled and showed alongside Chinese-American artists like Yoon Gi or the African-American artist Sargent Johnson and Hayward King. But we also might lean a little into the obvious elitism of this left-leaning circle and their politics, in which they were from essentially elite families, in which working for a living might not have been necessary, but also would have allowed for a more full pursuit of art making in a way that the non-white artists in particular had to be much more scrappy and money conscious in their own practices, that there is still these distinct class divisions that exist within this larger pre-war San Francisco milieu, which I think are super interesting to explore. Elaine Yao offers us little-known moments in Adaline Kent's career, in particular the kind of responding to wartime situations, and just to show you along these lines the kind of monuments that were never built. Isamu Noguchi also, while he had a lot of commission work, he also had monuments that were never unrealized. This comes from a dissertation from my own student, Holly Gore, who finished last spring in 2022, writing a dissertation about woodwork in which she discovered a trove of Noguchi's unrealized monuments. And so just to sort of showcase another West Coast artist who was a clear peer and friend of hers, but also somebody who came from a background, was raised by a single mother, and had to turn to paid work in the world of theater and in other places in order to support his practice. Elaine also works through a kind of history of advocacy and female friendship on the part of Betty Parsons, who was not known as a particularly female-friendly dealer, which means Adaline Kent was a rarity in her stable of artists, and had a kind of special purchase as somebody who had 3 in her own lifetime solo shows at the New York Gallery of Betty Parsons Gallery, which allowed her a kind of East Coast visibility that wasn't possible for most other women artists. And just along those lines, I wanted to share a lesser-known artist, Betty Fevis, who also is working in ceramics in Oregon, studied with Clifford Still at Washington State University, studied with Archie Pankow at Teachers College and at Columbia University, also had a kind of East Coast schooling and education, comes back to Oregon and begins experimenting with large-scale abstract forms, but never gets recognition largely outside of the state of Oregon. Her entire career is spent on the West Coast. And she's a bit younger than Kent, but I like to think of these groups of women. That's sort of the overview of what I do in my own practice, is try to think broadly across and think about how Kent becomes representative of a host of artists who have disappeared from our post-war and sort of 21st century moment, who I'll sort of read you a list. Claire Falkenstein, who was mentioned earlier, who was an artist who also spent time in Paris and resettles in Southern California. Mary Rank, who was a jeweler who worked in San Francisco. Ruth Asawa, who's gotten a lot of contemporary attention lately, but we can see as a kind of, that this doesn't happen for every woman artist who's being reclaimed. And so I'm really cognizant of the fact that if we want to put Kent in dialogue as somebody working through her materials, actually doing the work here of her own carving techniques. I like to think of her as a kind of predecessor artist for another outlier, Lee Bonteque, who also initially got a lot of attention in the New York art world and then retreated from it. I don't know that that would have been Kent's path. We don't know what she would have done going forward. In Alex Nemerov's poetic meditation on Kent, he propels forward a deep creative commitment to the ecstasy of art as transcending everyday life and in touch with the occult world of secular spiritualism. I think that he's putting forward a kind of hypothesis of Kent producing her work as divorced from the WASP Protestantism of her own upbringing, and more daring and weird, and perhaps even a token primitivist, as so much of early modernism in the 20th century was, seeking totemic religiosity in nature. Kent was an outdoors enthusiast, but also, as Nemerov suggests, even beyond this, as perhaps even a worshiper of animism. It makes me wonder, if Kent had lived into the 1970s, would she have made goddess figures, or would she herself have become a kind of earth mother or high priestess figure for a generation of 70s practitioners seeking out female progenitors in their work? And so now I'm going to join my group here and sort of pitch to you. I guess I'm supposed to take this off, yeah? Or no? No, that one. Okay. Is this on? Yeah. I want to open this conversation because now we've all seen but have not fully taken in the magnitude of Kent's practice. But since this is the first showing in, Apsara points out, 65 years of the largest grouping of her works that have been brought together, 120 pieces. That's a really fantastic achievement on your part. And also it gives us a lot of sort of introspection into how we would want to go forward. And so I guess I'd like to start this conversation by asking, what would each of you want for Kent's legacy? What would you like to have happen next?
Well, I'd like the show to go to New York. I don't think that will happen, but it would be nice.
But can't we get away from New York? Aren't we done with New York?
Yes, we are. We don't need New York. We can do it ourselves. Yeah, I mean, my wish for her is that just everyone will know her work, and she'll become greater known, greater recognized, written into all the art historical books, talked about as the really foundational artist that she was for the San Francisco art scene in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so that, her legacy will live on and reach out into the infinite.
I think seeing the exhibition in the full scope in which, Apsara and the Nevada Museum of Art has presented, I think something that still bears unpacking a little bit are those wonderful ink drawings back in that final space, because they seem to bring together so much of motion and movement in the ink gesture that you were discussing, Apsara, that is so evident in her athleticism and in her sculpture, but also I think unites the interest in sort of these timeless forms that she is seeing in her landscape and in her travels. I think there's so much said about her sculptural work, but I would love to have someone do a deep analysis and deep thinking about those ink drawings.
Yeah, when I think of the legacy, I'd love to see that show go to New York, even as we still have a chip on our shoulder. Although I remember I think Elmer Bischoff said once that, Park Avenue was 3,000 miles away, and that's just about the right amount of distance too. And so, I mean, yeah, that could be it. I, as a librarian, I like to think that there's, things on paper do last a long, long time. And so I love the fact that the exhibition catalog will be there for people to refer to. And as they see those names of people, and those people like Dorothy Leibs, her name probably is not in the book, but another woman artist from the middle of the 20th century that could use more recognition. But, Claire Falkenstein, Miki Hayakawa, there is going to be a book dealing with 4 Japanese women of the middle of the 20th century that's going to be a show at the Smithsonian, and they're all California artists. But hopefully her legacy will also be to propel a lot of other people who lived in that same world of hers that was overlooked to get a second look, at least from a historical perspective.
Yes, I suppose I would echo everyone's viewpoint that it would be nice if this artist became more and more known in the different canons of art history, but I think it's also interesting just to think about, the way that when works of art really have an effect on us, it's, in a certain sense, they remain unknown. That's the condition of their having an effect on us. It's precisely what we can't name, can't describe. Some of you will recall Bottom's dream in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is often held up as a very good metaphor of what a work of art is, to see it, to make it, and it's basically like I've had a dream, I can't describe the dream, only a fool could describe the dream. In it, the world's compass and corners were altered and changed, but I can't for the life of me describe it or recall it. I just know that it happened, and it's, to the word infinite, it's bottomless. It's and there's a kind of scatology there, but that's all fine. Body and spirit are all finally the same in this. So again, we underestimate the power of the unknown in our lives, and though that can easily be given a kind of unpleasant twang, a kind of mystical, paranoid sense of the unknown. That's not really the way in which I mean it. I mean it in a very humble, gentle, domestic way. It's just, we're unknown to one another. We don't know exactly who we are, and rather than a condition of chaos and uncertainty, or confusion, it's actually a beautiful kind of condition of what she'd probably call being. So sure, she can become better known, but let's give a shout out to being unknown still.
I'm going to answer my own question here and say that I think what becomes one of the strange paradoxes of museum culture is that most of the work has been preserved together in storage by the family and by the good stewardship and caretaking of Kent's daughters, granddaughters, and their generosity has allowed the possibility of Apsara doing a show like this and diving deep and not holding back. And that's also something that often happens in legacy projects like this, where papers are held back or letters are taken out or burned or trashed or gotten rid of to sort of take away the perhaps less, to cloak over relationships or histories that families don't want passed down, that they become controlling sometimes of the legacy of a long past artist. And that didn't happen in this case. But what I find interesting is this idea that, for me, what I would love to see is I would love to see Kent's work disperse and go to different institutions and have a piece here and a piece there and a piece at a different place in a different state altogether. And I think this is for me, the really interesting problem of not keeping everything together and wanting it to live out in the world in a multi-institutional way. And that means dispersing an archive rather than keeping it all in one place. And the sort of difficulty of, I think, those ideals, that as a researcher, it's much easier when everything's in one place, let me tell you. But when everything is dispersed, it becomes much more difficult, but also the possibility exists that people discover her work, which I think is the hope here. I would like to go back to this New York chip on the shoulder question or problem, because it plagues many of us working on the West Coast. And it's also, I would just give a little background here as somebody who lives in Southern California. This is a group of NorCal folks on the up here in Nevada. But there's been an awful lot of movement toward Southern California in the last decade and a half. The art world has exploded in Los Angeles. There are multiple New York and international galleries that have opened up second and sometimes even third branches of galleries in LA. The art scene has really taken off, and during the pandemic, many New York artists who felt claustrophobic in their 500 and 600 feet apartments and workspaces, when they could, left and departed for the West Coast in many facets, not just Los Angeles, but all over the West, to have this glimmer of the outdoors that I'm able to see from up here. And if you all turn around, you can see it too. But the kind of light and land and the possibility of glorious weather that doesn't exist on the East Coast. And so I wonder if there is this turn, or how do you feel about this turn toward the West that is actually happening en masse in the 21st century, particularly in modern and contemporary art, but contemporary art. And is this a lasting possibility, or is this going to be a fad? And how do you all feel about this move toward the West and what it might do for the field of thinking through artists like Adaline Kent, who were rooted in mid-century modernism on the West Coast? You want to go back this way? Or? Okay.
Let's see here. I find a certain sense of freedom in the West, just in terms of thinking and working. I did live in New York for 5 years and worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And I remember when I moved back to San Francisco, where I'm from, just getting back in touch with the horizon, which you lose when you're in New York, because you're so surrounded by tall buildings and ambition and all that. So that was very liberating to me. And I think that there is this kind of, and that is sort of like also a part of the history of the West in a certain way. Also in problematic ways, but so I find like a very productive, special place on peripheries, and you could kind of think of San Francisco as the periphery, a kind of periphery of the periphery, and same with Nevada. But I think it sort of there is a kind of freedom there, but there's also an isolation that's twinned with that. And I think that gets to a little bit of the unknown that Alex is maybe talking about. So, I think that art centers around the country and the world, there needs to be more of them, for sure. And there are many art centers. And when we get into this dialectical thinking of New York and Los Angeles, that as the only relevant art centers, used to be like Paris and New York, or that's very problematic. And I think we really need to expand our horizons in thinking more about all the other great artists that are working across the country.
I think of, my mind, speeds along, and I think of all the faddish things in Los Angeles. I mean, it's known for that, and it should be, and hopefully it'll continue to do those kinds of things. So yeah, it will continue to be faddish there without a doubt, although it is so big that it's bound to produce some really fantastic, ideas and new things, whether it comes out of places like, Cal Arts or, Track 16 Gallery or wherever else in Santa Monica or throughout LA or East LA, for God's sakes. But, I think of the trajectory of Art Forum, which begins in San Francisco, and in some respects rooted at the Art Institute, and then it moves to LA following, the Santa Monica folk at the Ferris Gallery, et cetera, and then gets to New York. And you think, God, maybe some of those things should split and, head off to Chico or Virginia City or, and, find a new grounding and a new way of participating. But, that's for people who are a lot younger to figure out. And by God, I have faith in them too, because they're going to do better than my generation.
I'll just say briefly that I think place is very important for artists and art making. In particular, I would say the place where you're from, childhood, et cetera, and that in a way is more important than the shifting locales of the art world. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I sometimes people say to me, like, you're from New York, right? And I'm like, I'm not from New York, man. So I have a great attachment to where I grew up, and I think that's important. But finally, separate from that and separate from the idea of where will the geopolitical centers of the art world be or move, I would just say a real artist makes the place where they are. It doesn't, I know these mystical pronouncements can seem not terribly helpful, but I think it's basically true. I just saw this movie on Netflix with Christian Bale called The Pale Blue Eye, which is about West Point and Edgar Allan Poe as a cadet in 1830. It's a murder mystery, but the portrayal of Poe is really excellent, and it's to do with the strangeness of the artist. And it can be categorized and defined and given that strangeness all kinds of credibility and academic and marketplace legibility, but finally, the artist, to be an artist, has to be a kind of stranger. And I think, again, coming back to this idea of the unknown, we have to remember that, whether we're a scholar or a patron or just a collector, a viewer, all of those things. It's again about the not knowing that's what brings us to a place like this.
Jenny, if I may, your question brought to mind immediately sort of this New York Times article. Maybe some of you have read or recall that really pitted, the LA art market and the scene against the Bay Area art scene. And among my colleagues and friends, just thinking about how that was such both kind of an unfair and unbalanced way of thinking about what an art scene ought to be, because it was so much about the market, which gallerists and which collectors were flocking where, and it just, that to me speaks to a bit of a faddishness, Jeff, that you that you brought up, and I think really overlooks what people do beyond that spotlight. And I think Apsara, it just, to me, that's the freedom that you were referring to. And I think of, at least in the Bay Area, some art centers that have been doing phenomenal work sort of under the radar, you might say. I think of Creative Growth in Oakland, one of the first centers to really take seriously uniting art making and practice and process with developmentally disabled individuals and adults, and creating these amazing art programs and kind of really pushing, again, the unknown of what the role of creativity in everyday life and who it can be defined as an artist. I think in my own more specialized research, which deals with quilt makers, it's, to speak of placemaking, you have a generation of African-American migrants who are coming from the South, and for both economic and racial oppression, are moving to the West Coast and remaking these geographies through their quilt making traditions and making it their own, and sort of kind of bursting forth these really innovative ways of thinking about textiles. And so I think, if people are captured or captivated by that art, that is for them. And all the better that New York maybe catches up.
I think also that there's something to be said for perhaps the era in which Adaline Kent lived was it was an era of formation. Museum formation was happening. It was a more innocent time to a certain degree in the art world. It was much smaller. It was a smaller scene of practitioners and people. That kind of what some people have denigrated as either regionalism or provincialism, I actually like to think of as the formation of community, and that there's quite a lot of community that happened at that time that we no longer have, or that we have a very fragmented sensibility about what community means, what community can nourish. One of the things I was really struck by here last night was the really strong sense of community that has formed around the Nevada Museum of Art, both in support and in docent culture and in attendance, and that this has become a center piece of this community, which I think is really important. And I just want to mention, because it's a tribute to all of you, that happens. It takes everybody to make a community and feel a community spirit. And so I think if you'd like, any of you would like to respond to this idea of community.
Yeah, I would like to. I think that's brilliant about the regionalism and segueing into community. And San Francisco at that time certainly was that. And a lot of it was due to Grace McCann Morley, who was the director of that museum, who made sure the community, the local community, was very much involved. And they were the ones who pushed that museum in a lot of ways. Not just the artists did for sure there, but also the community. When Guernica was shown twice in San Francisco, once right at the beginning of the war, and then a year later in a Picasso retrospective that had been begun at the New York Museum of Modern Art. But people in San Francisco were so intrigued with looking at this that they didn't want the museum to close, and they staged a sit-down strike to keep the museum open and keep the show there longer. And you think, well, that's the community that's doing that, and I get that sense of this place being that from last night, just as you say. When you think of McCagey, though, when you think of Grace McCann Morley doing those exhibitions and developing that and supporting women artists and artists from South America and elsewhere, she managed to do a really good job of mixing all of that stuff together into that community. But I don't think people had that chip on their shoulder at that time in the middle of the century in San Francisco whatsoever. They thought they were the bee's knees. And that exhibition, the Golden Gate International Exposition, they didn't include the East Coast very much in that. New York had its own fair that same year, big deal.
If there's no more responses, I was going to actually give the audience, you've been fantastic listeners and really wonderful, and I was hoping somebody might be interested in asking a question or having a comment. There's clearly lots of thoughts in the audience going on. Do you, oh, you're going to pass. I'm grabbing a mic. All right.
And Claire will come find you with a mic if you have a question. Oh, we have one over here. There's somebody over there.
Hi. Good to see you.
Hi, I'm speaking as a frequent visitor to the Nevada Museum of Art, and I love this museum very much, and I don't care much about New York, to tell you the truth. And I want to comment, make a comment to Sarah about how we have had a series of exhibitions at our museum that are very connected to Nevada, beginning with Ansel Adams many years ago and his still incredible photographs. And I had to write it down because there's so many. The Yosemite exhibit, which was wonderful, the Tahoe exhibit, and then we had Maynard Dixon, who was a Western artist, Jean Lamar and Jack LaMotte, who are Native American artists from this area, and we have, this museum is on Native American land, and we have a lot of Native American people living in Nevada, of course. So my question for Sarah is, and in the connection to the land and to the Sierras is a wonderful feeling for me because we all love this land and we love the Sierras and we love Tahoe. So I wonder what Sarah has to say about that kind of tradition continuing at the Nevada Museum of Art.
I think you're asking me. I would say that one of the things that I really loved about this museum when coming here is how the regional has been really uplifted and embraced and promoted in this spectacular way. And I think that is really the duty of an institution, is to historically mine and promote the artists that are living in the region and the communities that form around them, and that's really something to be celebrated. And I think that this museum has been really doing an excellent job at that, with all the exhibitions that you mentioned. And then it's also important to go beyond the region and to invite other people into the region and to think about how the region affects other places and how the region is inspired by other artists and thinkers. And so I think that that's something really special to cherish, and that happens at this institution.
I'm coming.
So I'm Lucy Kent Mossart, and Adaline Kent was my great aunt. And I just have learned so much from last night's event and today, and it just has given me such a greater appreciation of her works, her contributions, and also the Bay Area art scene. I learned so much more about, the 30s and 40s, and I just thank you all for putting on this show. It just has brought her to life and just been a very inspirational and an engaging experience. So thank you.
My name is Bonnie, and I work here at the museum. I'm a museum educator. And thank you all so much for all the different angles that you talked about her work. My question for all of you is, of all the works that didn't last or got broken in transit on the way to today, which would you most want to see in the exhibit, if you could choose any?
My God, there's so many. No, but, well, there was one, her work is very fragile, and so I think that needs to be underscored here. Terracotta, magnesite, the materials that she's working in are fragile. And it's interesting that she was, you spoke about the ephemerality, and how that contrasts to her interest in the infinite and the preservation of the work. But there is this amazing sculpture called Weather Eye that was included in the exhibition. I'm probably not supposed to say this out loud, actually. And when the museum that owns it was packing it, it accidentally fell over and broke. And it was like gonna hold a special place in the exhibition. And so that work didn't make it. And it's probably, hopefully, going to be conserved and will live again. But that one was really disappointing. There's also, and then there were some pieces that we weren't able to get for various reasons due to loans being declined. But I think we ended up with the perfect amount and representational work of hers. I don't know, do other people have works? There's so many. There's Ambush that you saw, there's Witch. There's so many of her works that are, the locations are still unknown. So that's another thing that I hope will come out of this, is that maybe there's Adaline Kent sculptures living in people's homes and they don't even know that they're Adaline Kent works. And maybe as a result of this book, people will think, oh, I have that work. I see it in the book. And they'll reach out and we'll relocate some of those works. But there is still a lot that's out there and we don't know where it is.
I would just add to that what I love is the inclusion and the reproduction in the catalog of all of the drawings for monuments that don't happen, and the idea that it's a way of showing to a larger public a kind of slice of an artist's aspirations for themselves and their possibilities and opportunities that never come to fruition. It's like their own dreaming and drawing or in thinking out loud on the page. And I'm somebody who spends a lot of time in archives, and you don't always get to reproduce that or find a way to show how generative that was for artists in their own time and place. And what I especially love about the catalog, and it doesn't end up on the wall of the exhibition, but it is in the catalog as a kind of document to that practice of dreaming, of thinking through and having these kinds of deep aspirations for one's own work. And I think that that's also one of the sort of beautiful and poignant and very sad things about her life trajectory, is that it was cut short by a car accident. I heard a lot of people wondering what it was. But that when an artist dies in midlife, with so much more possibility to have lived, that it makes it, we like to try to dream along with them, maybe, into the future and think about how it is they could have been received, what it is they might have gone on to do. I don't know what Kent would have done in the 60s, but she's a kind of proto-bohemian, and I think of her as a proto-feminist for the 70s generation, and to think about how she might have been received in later decades, and actually there would have been a greater appreciation for her work as a woman artist who made it through and kept working in this period that was actually very hostile to women, except in this formative Bay Area community.
Yeah, Lucita Hurtado is an excellent example in relation to that, and was a close friend of Adaline Kent's, and she just passed away at the age of 96, I think, 99. And I actually was able to commission her to make her only mural at the Berkeley Art Museum while she was still alive. But her work was, she was, I think, 96 when her work started to be appreciated. So that's kind of, it speaks to that in a certain way. I also want to speak to your point about all those missing objects. I was actually thinking about doing a wall of all of the missing objects. On the wall were the GGIE pictures are. But in the end, it was too hard to find all the images that were good enough quality, and I also thought that that would confuse people coming in from the beginning. But that was, I definitely had that in mind. And then there's one other work that I really want to find is Nevada Shore, which obviously I wanted to include in this exhibition. And because we couldn't include it, we made a postcard of it. So it's nice that we can think about that work as well. Yeah. There's one more.
Did we have one last question? I'll come to you with the mic.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been an amazing experience. I want to talk about multiples and her work with wallpaper, the two scarves that we see here, and that's not to kind of take away from the point about being struck by the object and the real kind of the directness of that. But also that a multiple helps you to kind of perhaps take that experience and with you and have a memory piece that evokes the experience, the direct experience with objects. Could you speak to that? And the decision to produce the scarves and the decision to make that wall of a wallpaper design that I believe she authored. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of multiples speaks to her, how she was really thinking so much more about how art can enter our lives through different media and circulate. I can't tell you how excited I was to be able to realize these scarves. And it felt like it is helping her work to live on and live with us in our lives. She also made jewelry. The wallpaper piece that you mentioned was made for an exhibition at SF MoMA in 1947 for an exhibition called Wallpaper by Pacific Coast Artists or West Coast Artists, I believe. And we don't know too much about that exhibition. I wasn't able to find, I'm sure if I went back to SF MoMA and really scoured through, but we both looked through those archives and we couldn't find the other artists that were in that show, but we did find that photograph that was in SF MoMA's archives. And then I think the family also had a photograph in their archives. And so we were able to just recreate the wallpaper based on that photograph. That's all we had to work with. And so we created a really, really high-res scan of that photograph and blew it up. And then a company in Belgium, I think, produced the wallpaper for us. And so that was also another special way that I thought we could, show the breadth of her work. But also including all these, the fabric that she made with Dorothy Liebs, which is shown when you first enter the exhibition and that collaboration with her. And then we produced that fabric pattern on pillows, which I really am excited to have a pillow too. So I think it's great when, art can live with you in your life.
Just to comment on that, the series of responses, and Jenny, you might be able to comment also more in depth too, but to me, the question of multiples speaks to Adaline Kent's intersection with the world of design. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the wallpaper, the jewelry. Sometimes I've always wondered about those lamps. Could they have, what it would mean to have them exist in other people's spaces or homes, and for individuals to collect them and to have that kind of intimate experience.
That was uniquely mid-century, too.
Yes. Yeah, and even with this idea of,
that was uniquely mid-century, too, in a way.
And where design and fine art are very intersected, and people don't see them as distinguished or different fields, or they're allied fields versus a hierarchy or a tension between.
Precisely. And I think, could she have pursued that further, to your earlier question of what other pathways could her art have been realized?
Yes. I think this is a good moment to wrap up. Thank you all so much. Been an amazing audience.
And I would like to thank all my esteemed panelists here for joining us. Thank you.